By Thursday, Sarah Kellerman no longer existed. Her employee ID deactivated. Her desk cleared. Her name scrubbed from every city record. When she called her own office, the receptionist said, "I'm sorry, no one by that name has ever worked here." Sarah was 21 years old. She'd been employed by the city for 6 months. 48 hours earlier, she'd done something unforgivable. She'd flagged a clerical error. One building, one extra apartment unit that shouldn't exist. 447 Riverside Lane showed 12 occupied units, but the 1952 permit authorized only 11. A simple mistake, she thought. Something a phone call could fix. She was wrong, because Sarah wasn't the first person to notice the discrepancy. In 1968, a building inspector flagged the same address. 2 weeks later, he resigned and vanished. In 1983, a zoning clerk submitted the same report. She disappeared within a week. Both of their files sealed. Both of their cases closed. And now Sarah understood why. The building didn't have an occupancy error. It had something worse. A room that wasn't supposed to exist. A history the city had buried twice before. And a pattern that suggested she was about to become the third name on a list no one admits is real. The question isn't, what's in the 12th unit? The question is, why does finding it erase you from existence? Drop a comment if you've ever discovered something you weren't supposed to know. And subscribe, because the people who tried to stop Sarah are still working at City Hall. Sarah Kellerman wasn't looking for trouble. She was looking for a future. The daughter of a postal worker and a high school librarian, she'd grown up in the kind of modest, predictable household where stability was the highest aspiration. She'd graduated from community college with an associate degree in public administration, and the clerk position at the municipal records office felt like the first rung on a ladder she intended to climb carefully. She showed up early, stayed late, and took pride in the precision of her work. The records office occupied the 3rd floor of City Hall, a brutalist concrete building erected in 1974 that always smelled faintly of floor wax and old paper. Sarah's job was unglamorous, digitizing decades of archived permits, cross-checking addresses, flagging inconsistencies for supervisors to review. It was tedious work, but she liked the rhythm of it, the satisfaction of turning chaos into order, one file at a time. On March 12, 1996, she was working through a stack of residential occupancy permits from the 1950s. The city had recently received a federal grant to modernize its record system, and Sarah's task was to verify that every address in the database matched its physical paperwork. Most of the files were straightforward. A few had minor errors, transposed digits, outdated street names. She corrected them and moved on. Then she opened the file for 447 Riverside Lane. The building was a 4-story brick structure in the Riverside district, a working-class neighborhood that had seen better days. According to the permit filed in September 1952, the building contained 11 residential units, 3 studios, 6 one-bedrooms, and 2 two-bedrooms. But when Sarah cross-referenced the address against the current occupancy database, the system listed 12 units. She frowned, pulled the physical permit from the file, checked again. 11 units on the original document, 12 in the database. She scanned the permit into the system, zoomed in on the floor plan. The layout was clear. 11 units distributed across 4 floors. No notation of any addition or renovation. No amended permit on file. Sarah wrote up the discrepancy on a standard flag 04 form and placed it in her supervisor's inbox. It was 3:47 p.m. She remembers the time because she glanced at the clock, wondering if she'd have time to finish another file before 5. Her supervisor, Donald Pritchard, was a man in his late 50s who'd worked for the city for 30 years. He had the weary demeanor of someone who'd learned to care deeply about very little. He picked up her form, read it without expression, and said, "I'll look into it." That was the last normal conversation Sarah Kellerman ever had at City Hall, because what she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that 447 Riverside Lane wasn't just another address in the filing system. It was a problem that the city had been trying to ignore for 44 years. And by flagging it, Sarah had just made herself part of that problem. By Wednesday morning, everything had changed. Sarah arrived at work at 8:15 a.m. as usual. She swiped her ID card at the security turnstile. The light flashed red. She tried again. Red. The security guard, a man she'd greeted every morning for 6 months, looked at her with polite confusion. "Can I help you? Miss?" She explained that her card wasn't working. He checked his computer, scrolled, frowned. "I don't see you in the system," he said. "Are you sure you work here?" Sarah stood in the lobby, stunned, as office workers flowed past her like water around a stone. She insisted there must be a mistake. The guard made a phone call, hung up, shook his head. "Personnel has no record of a Sarah Kellerman," he said. His tone wasn't unkind, but it was final. She felt heat rising in her chest, embarrassment, confusion, anger. She'd been there yesterday. She had pay stubs. She had an employee manual in her apartment. She walked 3 blocks to a payphone and called the main office line. The receptionist answered with practiced cheer. Sarah asked to speak to Donald Pritchard. "One moment," the receptionist said. A pause. Then, "I'm sorry, Mr. Pritchard says he doesn't know anyone by that name." Sarah's hand tightened around the receiver. "That's impossible. I work in his department. I submitted a form to him yesterday afternoon." Another pause. "Ma'am, are you sure you have the right office?" Sarah hung up. Her hands were shaking. This wasn't a technical glitch. This was deliberate. She walked back to City Hall and waited in the parking lot until she saw one of her coworkers, a woman named Janet Holloway, who sat 2 desks away from her. Sarah intercepted her near the entrance. "Janet, thank God. Something's wrong with my ID. Can you tell Pritchard I'm..." Janet's face went pale. She glanced toward the building, then back at Sarah. "I don't know who you are," she said quietly. "Please leave me alone." She walked away quickly, not looking back. Sarah felt the ground tilt beneath her. She spent the rest of the day calling everyone she could think of: HR, payroll, the union representative. No one had a record of her employment. Her direct deposit had been reversed. Her health insurance had been canceled retroactively. By evening, Sarah sat in her apartment surrounded by the evidence of her own existence. Her offer letter, her employee handbook, her ID badge, 2 months of pay stubs. She had proof. But proof, she was beginning to realize, didn't matter if no one would look at it. She called her parents. Her father, a practical man, suggested she'd been the victim of identity theft. Her mother asked if she was feeling all right, if maybe she'd been under too much stress. Neither believed she'd been erased. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She kept thinking about the flag she'd submitted, the building at 447 Riverside Lane, 11 units on paper, 12 in the database. It was such a small thing, a clerical inconsistency. Like, why would anyone care enough to do this to her? Unless the inconsistency wasn't an error, unless it was intentional, unless someone had been very carefully maintaining that discrepancy for decades, and she'd just exposed it. The next morning, Sarah drove to Riverside District. She needed to see the building for herself. It was a gray, drizzly Friday, the kind of weather that makes everything look older and sadder than it is. The Riverside District had once been a thriving neighborhood of first-generation immigrants and factory workers, but by 1996, it was mostly pawn shops, check-cashing storefronts, and buildings held together by inertia. Number 447 sat mid-block, a 4-story brick structure with narrow windows and a fire escape zigzagging down its facade. Sarah parked across the street and counted the windows. Like the building was exactly as the 1952 floor plan described. 3 units on each of the first 3 floors. 2 units on the 4th. 11 total. She could see the layout clearly from the street. So, where was the 12th unit? She sat there for 20 minutes, watching. A few residents came and went. An elderly man carried groceries inside. A woman with a stroller maneuvered through the front door. Normal. Ordinary. Nothing to suggest this building was worth destroying someone's life over. Then Sarah noticed something. On the 4th floor, between the 2 visible apartment windows, there was a 3rd window, narrower than the others. Dark, partially obscured by the fire escape. She pulled out the floor plan she'd photocopied before everything went wrong. According to the blueprint, that space should have been a shared utility closet. Not a window, not a room, just a closet. Sarah knew she should walk away. Every rational part of her brain screamed that this was dangerous, that people who could erase her from city records could do worse. But she'd lost her job, her income, her credibility. She had nothing left to lose and everything to prove. She needed to know what was in that room. She needed to know why it mattered. She waited until evening, when foot traffic thinned, and approached the building. The front entrance required a key, but the side alley door leading to the basement laundry room was propped open with a brick. Sarah slipped inside. The hallway smelled of mildew and fried food. Flickering fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. She climbed the stairs slowly, listening for voices, footsteps, any sign she might be caught. The 4th floor had 2 apartment doors, 4A and 4B. Between them, eyed barely noticeable, was a 3rd door, narrower, painted the same dull beige as the walls, as if someone had tried to camouflage it. No apartment number, no nameplate, just a door that, according to official records, shouldn't exist. Sarah pressed her ear against it. Silence. She tried the knob. Locked. She knelt and peered through the keyhole. Darkness. But not empty darkness, the kind of darkness that suggests depth, space, occupancy. A door opened behind her. Sarah spun around. A man in his 70s stood in the doorway of 4B wearing a bathrobe and slippers, holding a mug of tea. He looked at her with rheumy eyes. "You're not supposed to be here," he said. Not angry, just matter of fact. Sarah stood, tried to sound official. "I'm with the city, doing a building inspection." The old man sipped his tea. "No, you're not," he said. You're the girl who asked the wrong question." Sarah's blood went cold. "How do you know that?" The man glanced at the unmarked door, then back at her. "Because you're not the first. Every 10, 15 years, someone notices. They always come here. They always disappear." His voice dropped to a whisper. "Whatever you think you're doing, it's not worth it. Go home. Forget you ever saw this place." He stepped back and closed his door. Sarah heard 3 locks slide into place. She should have left. Instead, she stood there, staring at that unmarked door, and felt something shift inside her. Anger. Stubborn, clarifying anger. She wasn't going to disappear. She wasn't going to forget. She was going to find out what was behind that door, and she was going to make someone answer for what they'd done to her. But first, she needed to understand the history. If this had happened before, if others had noticed and vanished, there had to be records, evidence, something. Sarah spent the weekend in the public library digging through old newspaper archives on microfiche. She searched for 447 Riverside Lane and found scattered mentions. A fire in 1959 that damaged the 3rd floor but caused no casualties. A police call in 1971 for a domestic disturbance. A zoning dispute in 1988. Nothing unusual. Then, on a hunch, she searched for city employees who'd disappeared or resigned suddenly. The microfiche was maddeningly incomplete, but she found 2 names that made her hands go still. In October 1968, a building inspector named Thomas Rourke had been assigned to investigate complaints about 447 Riverside Lane. Residents reported strange noises, structural issues, missing mail. Rourke submitted a preliminary report noting irregularities in occupancy documentation and scheduled a follow-up inspection. He never filed the follow-up. 2 weeks later, the newspaper ran a brief notice that Rourke had resigned from the city to pursue opportunities in the private sector. No forwarding information, No goodbye party, just gone. In June 1983, a zoning clerk named Patricia Huang flagged the same building for having more units than its permit allowed. She sent a memo to her department head requesting clarification. 3 days later, she called in sick. She never returned to work. The city issued a statement saying she'd relocated out of state for family reasons. But Sarah found Patricia's name in a phone directory from 1984, still listed at her old address. She called the number. Disconnected. She drove to the address. The house was abandoned, windows boarded, lawn overgrown. Sarah realized she needed help. Someone with access to sealed records. Someone who understood how the system worked. She thought of her union representative, but unions were part of the system. She thought of the media, but without proof, she'd sound delusional. Then she remembered something her father had once told her. If you want to know what the city is hiding, talk to the people who've been around long enough to remember when they were hiding it. She found Harold Bremer in a nursing home in the suburbs. He was 82, a former city planner who'd retired in 1987. Sarah introduced herself, explained she was researching historical building records. Bremer's eyes were sharp despite his age. "You're asking about Riverside Lane," he said. Not a question, a statement. Sarah nodded. Bremer sighed, long and slow. I was wondering when someone would come around again." He told her the story. In 1952, a developer named Vincent Carraway purchased the lot at 447 Riverside and built the 4-story apartment building. The city approved plans for 11 units. But during construction, inspectors noticed something odd. The building's interior dimensions didn't match the blueprints. There was extra space. When questioned, Carraway insisted it was a measurement error, a quirk of the foundation. The inspectors let it go. The building was completed and occupied. Then people started noticing things. Residents heard footsteps in the walls. Mail disappeared. Tenants reported seeing a man in old-fashioned clothes walking the hallways late at night, but no one could identify him, and he never appeared during the day. In 1956, a tenant in 4A woke to find his apartment ransacked, but nothing was missing, and there was no sign of forced entry. In 1961, a woman in 3C claimed someone was living in her walls, leaving behind cigarette butts and food wrappers in hidden spaces she couldn't access. The city launched a quiet investigation in 1962. They brought in structural engineers, reviewed the blueprints, interviewed residents. The conclusion was unsettling. There appeared to be an additional unit built into the structure, accessible only from a concealed entrance on the 4th floor. But when they tried to inspect it, they couldn't find a way in. The unmarked door was locked, and no key existed in city records. Carraway, the developer, had died in 1960. His estate records showed no mention of an extra unit. Bremer leaned forward, his voice dropping. And the city made a decision. They decided it was cheaper to pretend the space didn't exist than to tear open walls and risk lawsuits. So they quietly updated the database to show 12 units to match reality, but never amended the original permit. That way, if anyone ever asked, they could point to the paperwork and say there were only 11. Plausible deniability. Sarah felt sick. But what about the people who noticed? Rourke? Patricia Huang? Bremer's expression darkened. The city has ways of making problems go away. Legal settlements with non-disclosure agreements. Reassignments to dead-end positions until people quit. In extreme cases, I don't know. I don't want to know. But I'll tell you this. I was told, in no uncertain terms, to stop asking questions about that building. And I did. Because I had a family. I had a pension. And I wasn't brave enough to risk it. Sarah asked the question she'd been dreading. "What's in the 12th unit?" Bremer shook his head. "I don't know. No one does. Or if they do, they're not talking. But here's what I can tell you. That building has been sold 7 times since 1952. Every owner tried to offload it within a few years. Every sale was at a loss. And every owner, when asked why, gave the same reason. It wasn't worth the trouble. Whatever's in that space, it's expensive to maintain secrecy around it. Sarah left the nursing home with more questions than answers, but one thing was clear. She needed to get inside that room. She'd tried the legal route, the official channels. They'd erased her. Now she'd have to go around them. She spent 2 days planning. She bought a cheap lockpick set from a hardware store and watched YouTube tutorials until her fingers cramped. She wasn't a criminal, but desperation makes pragmatists of us all. On a Tuesday night, she returned to 447 Riverside Lane. She waited until after midnight, when the building settled into silence. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, her heart beat loud in her ears. The unmarked door waited like a dare. Sarah knelt, inserted the tension wrench, and worked the pick carefully. It took 15 minutes, 15 agonizing minutes of scraping metal and held breath. But finally, the lock clicked open. The door swung inward on silent hinges. Sarah pulled a flashlight from her jacket and stepped inside. The smell hit her first. Stale air, dust, something faintly chemical. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 12. No windows. The window she'd seen from the street must have been a facade. The walls were covered in yellowed newspaper clippings, photographs, maps, hundreds of them, pinned and taped and layered over each other like the obsessive work of a conspiracy theorist. Sarah moved closer, shining her light over the collage. The clippings dated back decades, stories about missing persons, unsolved disappearances, mysterious deaths. All of them, she realized with growing horror, connected to the Riverside district. A factory worker who vanished in 1954, a school teacher who disappeared in 1967, a postal employee who walked away from his route in 1979 and was never seen again. 23 people spanning 40 years, all connected by red thread to a map of the neighborhood. And at the center of the map, marked with a black X, was 447 Riverside Lane. In the corner of the room sat a desk. Sarah approached it carefully. On the desk, a ledger, handwritten, meticulously maintained. She opened it. Each page listed a name, a date, an occupation. The entries went back to 1952. The most recent was dated March 14th, 1996, 2 days after Sarah had flagged the occupancy error. The name written there, in neat cursive, Sarah Kellerman, age 21, city clerk. Her hands trembled. This wasn't a cover-up by the city. This was something else. Someone had been documenting these disappearances, tracking them, recording them like a collector catalogs specimens. She flipped to the front of the ledger. The first entry read, Vincent Caraway, developer, 1952. Below it, a single line. The foundation requires maintenance. Sarah heard a sound behind her. She spun around. A figure stood in the doorway, a man in a dark coat, face obscured by shadow. "You shouldn't have come here," he said softly. Sarah backed against the desk. "Who are you?" The man stepped into the room. He was older, maybe 60, with the gaunt look of someone who'd missed too many meals or slept too few nights. "I'm the maintenance," he said. "I keep the records. I make sure the foundation stays stable." Sarah's mind raced. The foundation? What does that mean? The man gestured to the walls, the clippings, the map. This building was constructed on something old, something that demands balance. Every structure has a cost. This one's cost is memory. People forget. Names disappear. It's not malicious. It's architectural. He spoke like he was describing plumbing, not erasure. Caraway knew. He built it into the design. 11 units on paper, 1 hidden. The hidden one feeds the foundation, keeps the building standing. Sarah felt fury overtake fear. "That's insane. You're talking about people's lives." The man shrugged. "I'm talking about equilibrium. The city knows. They've always known. It's cheaper to lose a clerk every decade than to condemn a building and admit what's underneath." He reached into his coat. Sarah grabbed the ledger and bolted for the door. She ran down the stairs, out into the street, not stopping until she reached her car 3 blocks away. Sarah drove straight to a copy shop and scanned every page of the ledger. She mailed copies to 3 journalists, 2 lawyers, and a civil rights organization. Then she waited. Days passed. No one called. No stories ran. She followed up. The journalists said they'd looked into it, but found no corroboration. The lawyers said they couldn't take a case with no plaintiffs and no standing. The civil rights organization never responded. Sarah realized the truth slowly, painfully. No one would believe her. The ledger was just a journal written by a madman. The names were real, the disappearances documented, but without proof of connection, without bodies, witnesses, smoking guns. It was just conspiracy theory, and the city had too much to lose by acknowledging it. They'd buried it once. They'd bury it again. In May 1996, Sarah found work at a grocery store. She rented a room in a shared house 40 miles away. She stopped trying to prove what had happened to her, but she kept the ledger, and she kept watching the news. In 2003, a zoning analyst named Raymond Torres flagged an occupancy error at 447 Riverside Lane. He disappeared from city records 6 days later. In 2014, an intern named Lisa Brennan asked her supervisor about the building's ownership history. She resigned suddenly, citing personal reasons, and moved out of state. The pattern continued. Sarah documented each case, updating the ledger with new entries. She became what the man in the dark coat had been, the keeper of records, the maintenance worker for a truth no one wanted acknowledged. She never went back to the building. She never tried to expose it again. Why, it's because she understood now that some secrets are structural. They're built into the foundation, and tearing them out would bring the whole thing down. In 2019, the city finally sold 447 Riverside Lane to a development company planning to convert it to luxury condos. The renovation never happened. During demolition prep, workers reported feeling uneasy on the 4th floor, hearing sounds they couldn't explain. The company walked away, forfeiting their deposit. The building still stands today, though it's been condemned and fenced off. Sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing lights in a 4th floor window that, according to blueprints, shouldn't exist. Sarah Kellerman is 49 now. She still works retail. She still has the ledger. And she still wonders, how many buildings are like this? You know, how many cities maintain their own impossible spaces? How many people have been erased, their names removed, their existence questioned, all to preserve something that should have been torn down decades ago? The foundation, the man said, requires maintenance. But Sarah knows the truth. It's not the foundation that requires maintenance. It's the lie. And the lie demands sacrifice. The question isn't whether it will happen again. The question is, who will notice next? And when they do, when someone young and diligent and unlucky flags an error they were never supposed to see, will anyone remember Sarah's name? Or will she too have become just another entry in a ledger that no one believes exists? Some errors aren't mistakes. Some inconsistencies are warnings. And some buildings stand not because they're sound, but because we've agreed to ignore what holds them up. If this story made you question what's hidden in plain sight, leave a comment. And if you want more investigations into the truths we're not supposed to uncover, hit subscribe, because the records are still being kept, and someone needs to remember the names.